It is often claimed, especially by Roman Catholics, that Protestantism is a new, innovative form of Christianity, even a corrupt and non-traditional religion, where we don't have believers of our doctrine throughout the centuries passed on as tradition can mean, but that we only existed since 500 years ago. So let's quickly refute this complete falsity. We mustn't forget the many Christian groups that rejected the authority of the Roman pontiff, and that they held Scripture to be the ultimate authority, even higher than the so-called Pope and head of the Church. There are many proto-Protestant Christians throughout history. Before Luther, we had the Hussites flourishing from the 1400s to the 1600s. We have the Lollards, perhaps it's pronounced Lollard, also known as the Wycliffites. They flourished around the late 1300s to the early 1500s. The Waldensians, late 1100s to 1800s and beyond. The iconoclasts, who of course were those that opposed images and icons in church, even destroying them for the glory of the Lord. They were around the 700s and 800s and beyond, with our doctrines tracing themselves back to St. Augustine and beyond. Luther and Calvin himself were Augustinians, and Augustine believed in a sovereign and free grace. He believed in salvation by grace alone, the necessity for good works and perseverance by God's grace and power, and Luther and Calvin loved to quote St. Augustine. So many within these groups became Protestant in the years to come. The Waldensians still exist today. They're also known as the Waldenses, and their classical confessions, especially around the 1600s, affirm unconditional election, meaning that we are in the hands of the Lord. His sovereign grace makes the difference in salvation. Grace alone, His electing grace. Indeed, these proto-Protestants, especially these and others, were fiercely persecuted. So here are the three main proto-Protestant figures or leaders. First is Peter Waldo, who was born approximately 1140 and died 1205. Peter Waldo was a rich merchant who basically gave up his life of luxury and carnality, I believe. He sold all his goods, he gave to the poor, and he was an extremely generous man, him and his followers. They're called the Waldensians, and they relied heavily on the Bible and heavily on preaching as well. They did not blindly obey the Pope, bishops, and priests. They rejected prayers and masses for the dead. They rejected purgatory and transubstantiation. They were later absorbed into Protestantism. So they were separate from the Church of Rome for, I believe, a number of years, and then later on, after the Protestant Reformation, even centuries later, as you can see, they were absorbed. JohnWhitcliffe, 1328 to 1384, criticized and sought reform against the doctrine, corruption, and government of the Roman Church. He affirmed Sola Scriptura, predestination. He denied the authority of the papacy, even calling the Pope the Antichrist and of the devil. He rejected prayers for the dead, veneration of the saints, transubstantiation, and indulgences. He clearly taught salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, upon the sufficient righteousness of Christ. Yanhos, or Hus, 1370 to 1415, 100 years before Luther's conversion, I believe 100 years exactly before Luther's conversion. believed essentially the same as Whitcliffe. He may have believed in a form of transubstantiation or consubstantiation, but he believed those exact things listed before, and he gathered a large following. It is said that 90% of Bohemia eventually became Hussites. He had a massive influence, and more, I believe, after his death, more and more of his countrymen embraced his views instead of papal Rome. He also had profound respect for Augustine, calling him that holy man and great doctor, even the foremost of biblical expositors, more profitable to the church than many popes. And as we should know, Huss was burned at the stake 1415 by the so-called infallible ecumenical council of Constance. His last words before being burned at the stake, or at least very close to his last words: "The principal intention of my preaching and of all my other acts or writings was solely that I might turn men from sin, and in that truth of the gospel that I wrote, taught, and preached in accordance with the sayings and expositions of the holy doctors, I am willing gladly to die today." And so he was a very brave man. I believe he was a very godly man. He trusted in the scriptures rather than blindly following the bishops of Rome and their leadership. And he started the principles of how Protestants viewed the church, especially these kinds of distinctions between the visible and invisible church. He developed upon Augustine and other saints. He quoted a lot of saints in his books. So those are the top three, but we can mention a few side mentions. This man, Marsilius of Padua, 1270 to 1342, he regarded the Pope and the Church as below Scripture. The papacy was of human origin to him. He was anathematized by the Church of Rome. Also, Clorius of Turon flourished as bishop from 810 to 827. He was a Catholic bishop in the west, not the east, of Turon, which is in Italy. And he clearly stated, quote, "We are compelled also to realize that all the ancient fathers who were justified by faith alone." And he also condemned and destroyed images. This is a Western bishop, remember. So his iconoclastic beliefs proves that the 7087 council, which is called the Second Council of Nicaea, which promotes icon veneration, was not ecumenical or universally accepted, even in the West. Clorius was a good and zealous pre-Protestant. Luther also praised men like Girolamo Savonarola, and that was before the Reformation, of course, 1452 to 1498. Lorenzo Valla, some 60 years or so before Luther. Weasel Gainsfort died in 1489. So Luther also took comfort in the writings of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, probably a silent X. So this was centuries before Luther. And this is a good quote by Saint Bernard. He wrote to the Pope, "Who will permit me to see, before I die, the Church of God so ordered as it was in the old days, when the apostles cast their nets to fish for souls and not for gold and silver?" So I believe Luther, when he was in despair, his conscience was weighed down, especially before his conversion, he took comfort in Saint Bernard's writings. So Protestants, in closing, do not believe the Church of Christ was ever lost or destroyed. She is indestructible by God's sovereign grace and protection. There has always been a remnant of true believers in bigger or smaller measures throughout all human history. The church has never been conquered. Matthew 16:18, and I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Death and even the powers of hell will never prevail against the church. And there's always a remnant preserved by God, Romans 11, even preserved according to the election of grace, his electing and sovereign grace. And it's important to note on Matthew 16:18, Augustine said this, in a passage in this book, I said about the Apostle Peter, on him as on a rock the church was built. But I know that very frequently at a later time I so explained what the Lord said, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, that it be understood as built upon him whom Peter confessed, saying, Thou art the Christ, the Lord, the Son of the living God. And so Peter, called after this rock, represented the person of the church, which is built upon this rock, and has received the keys of the kingdom of heaven. For thou art Peter, and not thou art the rock, was said to him. But the rock was Christ, quoting from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. In confessing whom, as also the whole church confesses, Simon was called Peter. But let the reader decide which of these two opinions is more probable. And that is from his book, The Retractions. So he changed his mind. He used to believe Peter was the rock in this passage, but then he changed his mind regarding Jesus as the rock upon whom the church is built, and implies that it includes the confession, Jesus with the confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. This is the foundation of the church. And so he changed his mind in a sort of casual way, without controversy. And it is my contention that Augustine had no concept of the Pope in his days. The early church had no concept of a so-called visible head of the church, Peter and his successors being the infallible and supreme head of the entire church. They had no concept, because Augustine casually changes his mind about this, and he says, these two opinions, decide for yourself which is more probable. And so you see, Augustine, since he casually changed his mind about such an essential verse to Roman Catholicism, he did not believe or follow the Roman pontiff, the supreme head of the church. It was unknown to him. Jesus is the rock, repeatedly in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. Jesus is the rock even in Peter's epistles. And so we confess Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and upon this rock we should build the church, and the church will survive and prevail forever. And so we've looked at some proto-Protestants, and I hope this was encouraging to you. These are statues of those three men, including the Wycliffites in the bottom right corner. And God always has a remnant that believes in salvation by grace alone,